We started it in June. We said, take the month of July off Facebook. We told companies, don't advertise on Facebook for the month of July. And when we started the campaign, we didn't have a single company lined up. I mean, it was very audacious. 3 weeks later, we had over 1,100 companies, the biggest brands in the world.
Incredible.
Coca-Cola, McDonald's,
So why were they so
Starbucks.
receptive, do you think?
I'll tell you exactly why. Because we gave them examples of like white supremacist and anti-Semitic and racist content on Facebook, like flighted against their ads.
Yeah, that's pretty convincing.
So here's an Amazon ad, next to like a bloody truck that says, let's go get the next George Floyd. Or here's a Salesforce ad or a Verizon ad, and so on and so forth. And you put that out there, and Howard Schultz says, I don't want Starbucks advertising alongside the Nazis. But that's what Facebook was doing.
Wow.
And, like I've talked to them many times. I had a conversation once with Mark, and he said, around all of this, I think maybe that's in the book, and he said, Jonathan, a few years ago, all of the hate content on Facebook was user reported, he said to me. Today, 88% is caught by our AI before users even see it. So I think we're doing pretty good. And I said, okay, well, I used to be an executive at Starbucks. We didn't get to say 88% of our coffee doesn't have poison in it. So we think we're doing pretty good.
This week on Forward, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League and author of the new book, It Could Happen Here, Jonathan Greenblatt, joins us. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Forward podcast the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League and the author of the new book, It Could Happen Here, my friend, John Greenblatt. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Well, congratulations on this book. It's an achievement. It's frightening. I think most Americans, unfortunately, sense that it could happen here.
Yeah.
What prompted you to take the time to write this book?
Well, I guess I could tell the story about the book sort of by stepping back. So I've been the CEO of ADL for about 6.5 years, give or take. But I come to this work as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor from Germany. And my great-grandfather fought in the First World War. Germany was the only country that my family ever knew. And, before the rise of the Third Reich, they never would have guessed that, again, the only country that they knew would one day turn on them, regard them as enemies of the state, destroy everything that they ever loved, slaughter almost their entire network of family and friends, and force them to come, my grandfather, everyone else died, come to the United States as he did as a refugee. And that one day, when he was a young man, he couldn't have guessed that his grandchildren, me and my brother and my cousins, would be born in America. Never. And I come to this work as the husband of a political refugee from Iran. And, my wife and her family came here when she was 19, like in 1989, maybe 18. But the point is that, Iran was the only country they ever knew. And before the rise of, the Islamic Republic and Khomeini's fascism, they never would have guessed that one day the country would regard them as enemies of the state, destroy everything that they ever loved, and force them to flee and come to this country as refugees. My father-in-law never would have guessed that my kids and my nieces and nephews, that his grandchildren would be born in America. So I wrote this book because my own history tells us, and the world lets us know and reminds us that it could happen here. And if you and I, Andrew, want our grandchildren to be born in this country, we've got to fight for what we have. And we're foolish to think that democracy is preordained. We're foolish to think that we're somehow immune, not just from intolerance, but from the kind of catastrophes we're seeing play out around the world. And, we got to be in it to win it. We got to do something.
Now, the subtitle of your book is Why America is Tipping from Hate to the Unthinkable and How We Can Stop It. I have to say, my friend, I think you might have the hardest job there is. And I say this because you and I have both started and founded nonprofits.
Yep.
This is a different kind of nonprofit. I mean, the Anti-Defamation League is the most prominent anti-hate organization with a storied history. But I feel like it means that you are on the front lines all of the time.
Yeah.
That anytime there's any kind of episode, unfortunately, ranging from all the way from a mass casualty event or a shooting to someone making a misstatement that can be construed as hateful, you all get called. And I have to imagine that it must be like you're being bombarded by these kind of experiences all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say it's definitely a complicated job. I mean, I think, look, the ADL is an institution. As you said, it's actually the oldest anti-hate organization in the country. It was founded in 1913. So I feel a great deal of responsibility when I think about the legacy that I'm responsible for. As someone who's been an entrepreneur and been an innovator, now I'm in charge of this entity, and it feels like very portentous and really, a burden. And you're right. I mean, from Whoopi Goldberg to Pittsburgh, right? Like, there is a constant, set of events that force the ADL to show up and to speak out. And so part of the job is calibrating and understanding, when do you speak out, and when is it a tweet versus a full-on statement versus, an advocacy campaign? Like, how do you have to learn how to sort of calibrate appropriate to the offense and how to put things in some perspective. Because I will say, I mean, like, the stuff is happening, you said, every single day, and not just to Jews, to Asian Americans, to African Americans, to other minority groups. And so I do the job day to day.
Yeah, you must have a very, very strong mind, I would say, or heart or spirit, because having that as your day-to-day responsibility, I mean, it's something that not many people could work through on a daily basis. And at the end of your book, you actually say that when you were offered this role, it was either this or it seemed like it was head to the West Coast and return to entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Well, I had an opportunity, so basically, to step back, as you were saying, I have been an entrepreneur. I've been in business a long time. And I was working in private equity when I got recruited to work in the White House to run the Office of Social Innovation. The deal that I cut with my wife is we do it for a few years, then we go back to California. And I was going to go either start a fund or run a fund. And I was in negotiation with a big firm to do that. And I got this offer. And I took this job. There you go. But look, I believe in public service. And I felt like a call to service. And it felt like something that mattered. And in all honesty, I thought I would do it for a few years. And then I would resume my life in business. And then the week that I started on the job was the same week that Donald Trump announced his candidacy.
Wow.
So it was like the wheels came off.
Well, you and I met when you were at the White House
Yep.
as the director of the Office of Social Innovation and
Yep.
Civic Participation. Before that, for people listening to this at home, Jonathan founded Ethos Water, which is when you go to Starbucks, that really, really good-looking bottle.
Yep.
And you know that if you buy that water, a portion go to a good cause.
Yeah.
So you and I met back when you were, and I remember walking in and meeting you, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, wow, the Office of Social Innovation. I had started a nonprofit, Venture for America. So, of course, I thought maybe I can get some money out of the government, which did not happen, but we became fast friends. So talk about your arc, because you had a wide-ranging career. You kind of dipped in and out of public service. You were in the Clinton White House. You were back in the business world, and they managed to rope you back in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, I've always been motivated since I was in college, by wanting to change the world, which sounds a bit kind of glib or naive, but that was always sort of my true north. So when I graduated from Tufts, I went and joined the Clinton campaign and moved to Arkansas and worked for Governor Clinton in Little Rock.
Wow.
Well, and then he won, which, I didn't think he was going to win at the time.
You're like, I'm a genius.
I don't know about that. But then I ended up going up to D.C. and doing international economics for 5.5 years, like applied macroeconomic policy with an emphasis on international trade and investment in emerging markets. And that was great, and it was fun.
Did that take you all over the world?
Mm-hmm. All over. Particularly, it was like a remarkable time. So like the mid-'90s, You had the European kind of community becoming the European Union. You had, Germany literally politically reunified in the year 1990. And so you had this remarkable moment where, as in 92, as again, the European Union really came together and moved to becoming an economic entity. It was remarkable. You had NAFTA and the emergence of free trade in the Western Hemisphere, and Mercosur, which is a trading bloc of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. And then there was a movement toward a free trade agreement of the Americas. You had APEC came online. I mean, China.
Sounds like you were attending a lot of conferences.
A lot. I've been a lot of and done trade negotiations. I worked on APEC as ASEAN was coming into the fore, right? Which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which was an economic bloc. It was 7 countries. Now I think it's 10 or 11 countries. And as China was accessing, or Hong Kong was coming out of, as a British protectorate.
Yeah.
And China was coming into, were we talking about this before? About China getting most favored nation status and joining the WTO. In fact, I remember when the GATT, the Joint Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, became the World Trade Organization. So I worked at the nexus of all this really interesting stuff.
Well, yeah, it sounds like you were right there at the forefront when the world was kind of knitting itself together into this world order. And now you and I were talking before we sat down about how it seems like that order is coming apart. It's reversing itself. You talked about the dramatic impact of sanctions on Russia that many people in America probably don't appreciate what that actually means day to day in the Russian economy.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so it's interesting. To your point, I think we all believe there was this kind of gravitational force called globalization that was inevitably drawing us together. The reality is globalization isn't an outcome, it's an intention, and it requires will and work, and it can be reversed as we're seeing. So we're talking about economic sanctions. Economic sanctions are a kind of warfare, and it may be invisible and you don't see it in Midtown Manhattan, but in Russia, the value of the ruble has basically dropped to almost zero. They can't get any hard currency. And because Russia's been cut off now from Western trade flows, they have $600 billion in reserves around the world that they can't get their hands on. And so the value of Russian bonds is also going to plummet to zero, which is going to impact all these big companies, and it'll have ripple effects on emerging markets around the world. It's going to be harder for those countries in Southeast Asia, in South America, Latin America more broadly, to get access to capital too. I mean, frankly, emerging markets are probably pretty cheap right now. You can buy it at quite a discount. But I think it's going to have all these impacts. And so for ordinary Russians, not only are their boys being sent to fight in a war that they don't understand because they all have family and friends in Ukraine. Want nothing to do with. Suddenly, their purchasing power is de minimis. And so that's going to create all kinds of unintended consequences. I mean, just wait. Putin is being backed into whether we might not be flying bombers into Ukrainian airspace, but believe me, we are backing him into a corner, and it'll be interesting and maybe a little bit scary to see how he responds.
Well, we all hope that reason prevails and peace returns. I mean, the goal of these sanctions is to elevate the pressure to a point where it feels like he'll come to the table. But you're right that that's uncertain. I assumed Putin was too rational an actor to engage in this sort of aggression.
So now this is the reality, right? So by our means, by our Western standards, from our American kind of calculus, it's irrational. But in his mind, who's aspiring to recreate a czarist imperial kind of moment, he's acting rationally. And he's willing to sacrifice those soldiers and, risk his economy to achieve this imperial ambition. So this is, one of the things that I think we in the United States, we're all very sort of solipsistic and we see things through our own story and our own image. But the reality is that we need to take these sort of tyrants at their word. We think they're not irrational, but in their mind, they're actually being highly rational. So when Putin says he believes in a greater Russia, when Khamenei says he wants to annihilate the Jewish state, when she says there is one China, they mean it. And we need to listen to them, and we need to reimagine kind of our political calculus in light of what they're telling us.
Winter is finally ending and the sun is starting to peek out, but that does not mean that we are all feeling 100%. It has been a very, very tough time, and sometimes we need some help. It's why I am proud to be sponsored by BetterHelp, which is going to get you the help that you need via online therapy with a professional, not someone who doesn't know what they're doing or your friend who just has to put up with it, but an on-call online therapist that will meet you when you want, how you want, totally confidential. I am pumped for people to be able to get this help. It's more affordable. You can be matched with a therapist in under 48 hours. Over 2 million people have used BetterHelp online therapy to take charge of their mental health. And if this describes you, and I got to say it describes most of us, you should probably at least check out BetterHelp. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp, and Forward listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/yang. That's BetterHelp.com/yang. Mental health is health, people, and you can take care of yourself better with betterhelp.com/yang. So you spend the 90s helping establish this world order
That's
and
falling
international
apart.
trade. That's now falling apart.
So well done, Jonathan.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, someone had to build it.
Right.
You returned to the business world for
So I did
extended period of
that.
time. Yes.
I got an MBA. I mean, I wanted to change the world, but then, there was gridlock in Washington, and I wanted to go. I saw business as the front line.
Yep.
So I got an MBA at Kellogg at Northwestern, and then went to be part of the internet. And I joined a little pre-IPO company called Realtor.com,
Yeah.
which ended up going public and being very big. I was like the assistant, junior, associate product manager. I was just north of the receptionist. But I learned how to build software products, how to manage teams of engineers. And that's what I did. And so I ended up, after a few years, running the consumer products division of the company and responsible for a whole line of products. But I missed public service. So my roommate from Kellogg, this guy named Peter Thum, had this idea to create a company, Ethos Water, which was bottled water at the time was a $15 billion category. It's really starting to grow in the United States. And yet there were a billion people who lacked clean drinking water. So the idea was, could you create a bottled water that would use part of its profits to help children around the world get
You were
clean
one
water?
of the OG social entrepreneurs before it was cool.
Well, it's nice of you to say.
No, it's true. No, that's
Yeah.
accurate.
I mean, when we this word social entrepreneur, there's a guy named Bill Drayton
Yeah.
from Ashoka and Jacqueline Novogratz kind of down the
Sure.
street here who talked about it, but few others did.
Very few.
There weren't classes at business schools.
No.
There weren't, there was no B Lab. There was none of this whole movement we have today.
Yep.
But we took our inspiration from people like Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield and Gary Hirschberg and Gordon and Anita Roddick and Yvonne Chenard. These who created like Patagonia and Body Shop and Stonyfield and Ben & Jerry's respectively. Because there was that generation. Then we were like part of the second generation, I would say, with people like Jeffrey Hollander from Seventh Generation or Seth Goldman from Honesty, this guy Dan Lubetsky. Started this company called Kind.
Mr. Kind Bars himself, who's one of our mutual friends.
Mutual friend.
I tell a story about meeting him in the White House, and then he asks us, hey, anyone hungry? And someone says yes, and then he busts his jacket open, and he has Kind Bars all in the lining. Like I call it like Batman. It was like his utility belt.
Isn't that funny? Yeah, I mean, he's always an entrepreneur. He's got the hustle.
That man hustles.
He's got the hustle. So, and then the third generation of those entrepreneurs, I think, are people like Neil Blumenthal and the guys from Warby Parker, or Blake and the guy from Tom's, and the guys from Bonobos, who have done a really smart job. Again, I think Peter and I had this innovation, link consumption in college. You buy the water, you get the water. And then Blake did it with, you buy the shoes, someone gets shoes,
totally.
Or you buy the socks, someone gets the socks, and so on. And I think that's a marvelous model.
So Ethos ends up getting acquired by Starbucks.
We sold it to Starbucks. Yeah. And then I worked there running the bottled water business.
So just random aside, we want to discuss this.
Mm-hmm.
So Howard Schultz runs for president or has an exploratory committee for 2020.
Yeah.
Did you advise on that? Were you around the team for any of that?
I
Jazz?
did not. So I've kept in touch with Howard, and I knew, like Howard has been, I learned so much from him. It was I have such gratitude for having the chance to work for him. But this was a long time coming. I mean, if you looked at even Starbucks, they had a domestic policy agenda. They supported veterans. They supported boys and young men of color, health care to all their employees. They did the deal with Arizona State University, free education, college education for Starbucks partners or baristas. So they from education to veterans to healthcare. It was remarkable. And he's got so much passion and so much energy, and a lot of hubris. But I say that I say that as a compliment because to build a business like you did,
you need a degree of confidence to either build a company like Starbucks or run for president.
Do you know something about that?
At least one of those two. I know something about. So they got you back into public service. You had a really plum job, I thought, like in terms of cool jobs in the administration, social innovation, civic participation.
Yeah.
One of the things you write about in your book that I'm passionate about is a call to national service.
Yes.
It could potentially help depolarize people, make
Absolutely.
people see each other as look, we live a little bit differently, but you're more or less just like me. So you were part of an office that was helping to drive various organizations. What do we need to do to actually reestablish national service?
Look, I have actually never heard that phrase before, but it's right. Depolarization.
Yep.
I believe in that. And service is a strategy to achieve that end.
Yes.
It's interesting. I believe President Biden in his the Build Back Better bill, which I think is now DOA, and they're trying to break it up. But he had dollars in there, $16 billion to create a climate corps of some kind. Look, the idea, young people like you at one time, like me at one time, they all
at one time. It's funny we say that.
Long time ago.
Yeah.
But they want to change the world. And I think the folks who are farther along should help them and give them help create the space, give them the lane to do that. And national service is a way that it can be done. And so I just think there's something incredibly powerful, but it's going to take funding so that young people can actually earn a living or earn a little bit, if you will. And it's going to take creating the space to give them the opportunities, whether it's, again, in education or healthcare or with veterans, et cetera, to do good in our communities.
Well, the reason I ask is that I've been part of gatherings where they talked about national service. Everyone's like, yeah, let's do it. But people look at it and think, well, in order to do it at scale, you pretty much need the government because
you do.
The dollars add up pretty quick.
Yeah, the previous cost of the stipend was, I think actually today it's about $16,500, meaning the government pays young people an annual salary of sorts of $16,500. And so the kids who do national service, man, they're not staying at the at the Ritz, even the Holiday Inn Express. They're sleeping on cots in the basement of the church.
Totally.
They're not flying United Premium. They're driving 15 people in a 12-person van.
Yeah.
And again, they're not eating, at some fancy sushi restaurant. They're eating ramen noodles. But what's sustaining them and nourishing them is the act of building community. It's amazing, but it requires money and it requires both sides. I think some people on the right still see national service as a democratic Bill Clinton.
Because it seems so
there are
patriotic.
some.
That's odd.
There are some, and I think there's some on the left who also want them to do very specific things. So, but the best, what I mean by that is there's a tradition of service in our military.
Yeah.
But that's derided by some on the left. And by the way, faith communities have amazing tradition of service.
Yeah, it's true. Missions.
The Church of Latter-day Saints. If you've ever met anyone who's a self-identified Mormon, their commitment to service is unbelievable. So I think the left needs to acknowledge the power of faith-based service and military service. And the right needs to see the power, the non-political nature of service of all kinds.
Well, it's interesting you raise this because I actually hadn't encountered resistance to national service from the left. But as you say this, so one thing I did encounter, and this is just a story I'll share, is that I'd started an anti-hate campaign and I wanted to use the American flag as part of it. And there was resistance among people around using the American flag. And I was like, guys, if we don't use the flag, then we lose. It's if you let let's say a certain party own the flag. Like, like
that's bananas.
It was an anti-Asian hate campaign. And so it was all Americans, and was like, look, Asians are American, like, like, let's denote that in some way. And then there was resistance to using the American flag. And I was like, how else can you say that Asians are Americans or Asian Americans are Americans without the flag? Like, I just didn't see a way to do it.
This is crazy. So I was actually just having a conversation with someone a few days ago, and I said, I believe in American exceptionalism, because I do. I mean, I think America is so different than other nations before us, and we're an idea. And, there are other countries who are bound up in powerful ideas like France or China or Israel or others. But what's so powerful about America is this idea that we are not, although there are indigenous Americans, and we should talk about the way that they were treated. And of course, the economy was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, and that's a sin for which we are still paying. And yet, the power of America is the acknowledgement of our imperfections, the idea that all of us as immigrants or refugees or whatever the case, or former slaves, can come together as one. And so I think that's inspiring. And the people who would say that the American flag is somehow a political symbol just don't get it at all. Like, I'm sorry. What hope do we have if we think that the founding national symbol is somehow a problem?
That was my stance as well. So, but that was one of the encounters I had where I was like, like, people really see this a bit differently. And I think that, I think part of it is age, really. Like there are people that are a bit younger than you and I who might have like a slightly different framing of it. There's not that much that unites people nowadays, but one thing just about all of us have in common: we love to sleep. We love to curl into bed and get some shut-eye, and it's important what the heck we are sleeping on. It's one reason why I am pumped to be sponsored by Helix Sleep, where they can personalize a mattress just for you. Soft, medium, firm. Do you sleep on your stomach? Do you sleep on your side? You can go to helixsleep.com and take a quiz, and then they will send you a mattress tailor-made for you. It's 2022. You can have it the way you want it. And it's not just me. Helix was awarded the #1 best overall mattress pick of 2020 by GQ and Wired magazine. Just go to helixsleep.com/yang, take their 2-minute sleep quiz, and they'll match you to a customized mattress that will give you the best sleep of your life. You can try it out for 100 nights risk-free. That's right. You can sleep on something for 99 nights and then return it. It would be weird. I don't recommend it, but you can do it. Helix is offering up to $200 off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners at helixsleep.com/yang. helixsleep.com/yang. So after you leave the Obama White House, they managed to rope you into, not rope you into, I mean, it's an incredibly important.
Rope me in. Rope me in. Rope me in, for sure.
To become the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League.
Yeah.
And then Trump runs for office around that time.
Yeah.
From your book, it seems that there's been a dramatic worsening of all sorts of episodes of hate, whether it's measured in terms of speech, language, social media, posting, all the way up through violence and militias.
Yeah, I mean, the data doesn't lie. I mean, so just take anti-Semitism, which so often is considered the canary in the coal mine, like it's a harbinger of much of equally and even more destructive forms of hate. Anti-Semitic incidents from 2015 to 2020 have leapt about 114%. And I know this because at ADL, we track anti-Semitic incidents.
Yes.
We have 25 field offices, and we're tracking acts of not just violence and vandalism, which the police also monitor, but acts of harassment, right, and bias, which might not catch the attention of law enforcement. So a kid is bullied at school. An elderly person is yelled at on the street. Like, we get all those calls. Our staff investigated over 9,600 incidents in 2021. Wow. We have 400 full-time employees doing this work. And so just the number of raw incidents is way up. And by the way, again, like as kind of we were alluding to before, there's no question that right-wing extremism is driving a great deal of this. I mean, the number of anti-Semitic incidents like correlated directly to the Trump years. It just, like it or not, it just did, right? The numbers leapt up in the second half of 2016 once he won the nomination. And like after Election Day, Andrew, it was like a straight line up.
Terrible.
And yet at the same time, you know, it's not like either side of the spectrum has a monopoly on morality. Like we saw here in New York in Midtown last May, this spike in anti-Jewish hate around the fighting in Gaza, where Jewish people who were guilty of the crime of like wearing a kippah in public, or being Orthodox, like wearing a black hat. We saw people beaten up in broad daylight in Times Square. We saw people assaulted, like in other parts of Midtown Manhattan. We saw people attacked in Brooklyn. Oh, and by the way, in Los Angeles and in southern Florida and in Las Vegas and in Chicago. And in all these places, the attacker didn't say, you know, what's your opinion on the two-state solution? Or are you a quote-unquote Zionist? Like the people were identified as Jews, and that made them targets. And the people who were beating them up, Andrew, to be crystal clear, the assailants weren't wearing MAGA hats. They were wearing like Palestinian keffiyehs. And in Times Square, a guy was attacked and hit with a flagpole, you know, and it wasn't like a Trump 2024 flag. It was like a Palestinian flag. Now, I say this as someone who believes in a two-state solution. I say this as someone who thinks Zionism and Palestinian nationalism must coexist. And we need dignity and equality and safety and security for Israelis and Palestinians in two states. But it's undeniable undeniable is the wrong word, but it's impossible to ignore the animus that's directed not against just the Jewish state, but all Jewish people.
Clearly, it's just hatred if you're attacking someone on the street for nothing other than their faith, their appearance.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting. I'm thinking about, again, you were talking prior about starting this organization to fight, AAPI hate. Like, you might not like the way Beijing is treating the Uyghurs, or you may have questions about, what happens to their tennis stars or democracy activists in Hong Kong, but that isn't an excuse to beat up elderly Asian American people in Queens, or to assault like a elderly Thai man in San Francisco and kill him, or to shoot women in Atlanta. Like, no, stop AAPI hate, just like we should stop anti-Semitism, period, full stop.
I'm going to share some stories from my upbringing. So I grew up in a predominantly white town. I was one of the only Asian kids. There were maybe 2 Jewish kids. And we both got picked on a lot. Though I will say that the Jewish kid got it worse. And I didn't realize it because I was quite young.
Right.
So I would get chink, gook, like go back to China, that sort of thing. Not great, obviously, if you're like a 12, 13-year-old. But the Jewish kid, they tried to cut a swastika out of a plastic tray to give to him. Like it was like another level.
Right.
And again, did not appreciate it because at the time I was like 12, 13, 14. But you said something earlier about how Jews are the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah.
It seems like when you have an environment that's conducive to hate, for whatever reason, the energy around anti-Semitism is always higher or elevated, and Jews are the single biggest victims of like oppression and even genocide internationally. There's something where there's a reason why the ADL, frankly, it was founded as a Jewish organization, but then those things tend to cascade to other groups. I'm just going to, again, use my, intermediate school example as like the Jewish kid had it the worst. Yeah. And then there are others of us that got versions of it that was like less virulent, but still nasty. And I feel like, that's true societally.
Yeah. Look, I think, for 2,000 years, the Jews lived in exile. The state of Israel's founding withstanding. For 2,000 years, the Jews lived in exile outside their ancestral home in the Middle East. They lived in Europe, they lived in Latin America, they lived in the Middle East. And wherever they went, they were the other. They had their own they didn't adopt Christianity. They didn't adopt Islam. So they had their own religion with their own way of praying in their own language and their own customs. And they were, I think we would use the term today, otherized, right? They were marginalized. They were typically not allowed to live in, whether it was the church or the crown or the mosque, they weren't allowed to live where the rest of the community lived. They weren't allowed to work in the professions the rest of the community worked in. And when things went wrong, and they always did, especially before like the advent of the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, when an understanding of kind of the scientific method and the things we take for granted today, when like there was a bubonic plague, or there was a weather system, or there was some other disease or whatnot, they blamed the Jew. I mean, they always thought that it was the Jew for not accepting
Awful.
Christ or not accepting Allah or for who knows what. And so the Jew made a convenient, because there were minorities of Jews all over, they were a constant convenient scapegoat. But as you were kind of just mentioning, I think, anti-Semitism starts with the Jews. It never ends with the Jews.
Yeah.
And that lesson that you can scapegoat somebody, that you can otherize them, it's easy to do with the Jews, then it becomes easy to apply to others. So I think that, it's interesting, the ADL. So the ADL, I'll tell you in 30 seconds. The ADL was founded in 1913, around the time that a Jewish man was lynched. He was falsely accused, a man named Leo Frank. He went from New York down to Atlanta to manage a family business. A young girl was found killed on the property. They immediately blamed the Jew. Now, keep in mind that this happened at a time when Jews weren't allowed to work in many professions. They couldn't get treatment at many, like healthcare facilities. The reason why you have all these hospitals named like Beth Israel or Cedar Sinai is because the Jews started their own medical institutions because they couldn't get treatment in other places. They couldn't attend many universities. Quotas kept them out. Couldn't live in. There were restrictive housing covenants prevented them from living in many places. So they faced what we would call, like in our parlance, structural discrimination or structural racism. And this Jewish man is falsely accused of a crime. I mean, he didn't commit it. He wasn't there, nonetheless. Falsely accused, wrongfully convicted, and sentenced to death. The governor of Georgia at the time, because he didn't have due process, intervened and commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. And the mob was so enraged by that act of leniency, they tore Leo Frank from his jail cell and they hung him from a tree.
Awful.
And while the body is still hanging from the rope, the whole town gathers and holds a picnic, underneath the corpse. And they take pictures, they take photographs and turn the pictures into postcards and give them out as souvenirs.
Wow, that's inhuman.
You can still see Leo Frank postcards all over the internet. They're all still out there. So in that moment, a group of Jews get together and say, we need to actually do something about this. They create this group, the Anti-Defamation League. And they write a charter, we would call it a manifesto. And in it are the words that they wrote 1913, not recently, that we still use today as our mission statement, that its purpose is to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. So what's so interesting about that is 100 some odd years ago, the Jews in the United States were weak and vulnerable. They didn't have, social standing or economic resources or kind of political influence.
Yep.
Like their future was very uncertain. But what they realized was this idea that we're talking about, that in order to fight for the Jewish people, you also had to fight for all people. And that only when all people were safe could Jews also be safe. I mean, we're the only group out there of our vintage that has this, to use a term that's in vogue with the kids, this intersectional notion of justice, that you fight anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. So you're particular and universal. And so it's animated this organization for 100 plus years. So in 2020 or 2021, when we incubated the Asian American Foundation, we did that because at ADL, that's what we do.
Yeah. So to give people some background, some prominent Asian American leaders were concerned about the incidents of hate and people being beaten and in some cases even killed. And they called John for advice. And then John rolled his sleeves up and helped inaugurate the Asian American Foundation, which, as an Asian American, I'm immensely grateful, but also think, wow, like we haven't had something like this until now. I mean, there was something of a void, and it is unfortunate that only when a community feels itself to be in the crosshairs or threatened in terms of their family safety, then they gather together and try to make a change.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on a couple fronts. I mean, I think typically maybe it's human nature, we take for granted what we have, like frogs in the boiling water. We don't realize there's a problem until it can be too late. So I think again, we get back to what makes America great. It's creating this space and having a civic society which is so kind of fertile and conducive to people saying, hey, we need to do something about this, and doing something about it. I mean, the Asian American Foundation, they have raised over $1 billion in incremental capital to fund AAPI causes from foundations, corporations, it's kind of mega donors. It's amazing what they're doing. And, I think if ADL and the Jewish community can share even a little bit of what we've learned the hard way to help the API community, or again, the African American community or whatnot, I think, I think that's a blessing.
So one of the most compelling stories from your book that I found engrossing was the story of a guy named Damian Patton.
Mm-hmm.
And so Damian Patton's a young Jewish boy, kind of lost soul.
Yep.
And then he winds up being radicalized and joins a white supremacist group.
Yep.
Even participates, becomes something of a young star and leader.
Yep.
And it's obviously something that people don't even imagine possible, that where they didn't know he was Jewish.
Yeah, that's right.
And he was concerned that he'd be outed as Jewish. Like, he brought one of his new friends home, and then his mom's like, what the hell? Like, you're a skinhead, you're Jewish. And then he had to deny it. So I thought this story was so powerful and humanizing, because what it showed was that this radicalization can prey upon, or it feels like a human need that people have, almost regardless of background.
That's right. I mean, I think people yearn for community, right? Especially that lost soul, is so eager to find a welcoming group where he or she can fit in. And in Damian's case, he was from a broken home, didn't have strong role models, found himself kind of attracted to gangs. First, like Latino gangs, because he had a friend who was Hispanic, and then eventually got pulled into the white supremacist movement. And it's extraordinary to think that someone, again, could deny who they were and get pulled into something so toxic and clearly like self-destructive. But he did. And not only did he get involved with them, he traveled from Southern California to Tennessee. They committed a crime. He was in the car with 2 adults when he was still a minor. And they shot up a synagogue. Thankfully no one was killed, but not for lack of effort. And they were arrested. And they were arrested, indicted, and sentenced. But he was a minor. So whereas the 2 guys went to prison, he was let off. And then he went on to join the military, found community there, eventually found out he was pretty good at coding, built a successful tech company, venture-backed, on his way to an IPO in the burgeoning tech scene in Salt Lake City, where there's some interesting stuff happening, and got outed. Some investigative reporter found out his past, which Damian had never come clean about. And he was outed, and he was humiliated, and he was literally fired from the company that he built with his bare hands from the ground up, and relieved not only of his responsibilities as CEO, pushed out entirely by the board.
Yeah, so I think this is really important, because this is about when you met him, when he came to your attention.
Yeah.
So someone in their distant past, their adolescence, is affiliated or is a white supremacist.
Yeah.
Serves in the military, goes on to become a business leader. Years and years pass, and then someone produces records being like, hey, this person was a white supremacist,
Yes.
has tattoos to that effect.
Yeah.
And so if you just look at that headline, you just think, well, this person's terrible because, like they were an active white supremacist. Meanwhile, this person had like a completely different life arc.
Yeah.
And I mean, he had a family.
Yeah.
Yeah, which happened obviously after he was
Long after, yeah.
long after. And so then the company looks at him and says, "Well, you got to go because like we can't have like a white supremacist founder. That's going to like destroy the company. Like we're trying to go public."
Yeah.
And then he's looking at it like, "Look, this is a part of my life that has like not been a part of my life
Yeah.
for decades and decades."
Yeah.
And so when you were brought in to talk to him, like, and it was one of the things I admired about both, your account in the book and your work is that you treated him like a human being.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I deserve credit for that. I think that's the basic. What happened was a friend of mine, because I worked in Silicon Valley for many years, who was a venture capitalist, which was a Jewish fellow, called me and said, "Hey, Jonathan, I know this. I'm an investor in this guy's company. It's a crazy story. Would you talk to him?" So first of all, he had a valid introduction from someone that I trusted.
Yeah.
But I also called him because, like, Nick Cannon, who's a friend, has this phrase that he uses, which I've wholesale adopted and take credit for. He says he doesn't believe in cancel culture. He believes in counsel culture. And I think there's so much truth to that. So in Damien's case, yeah, he erred. Yeah, he sinned. But if you look, I'm Jewish. I believe that we're all created in God's image, but we're not God. We're imperfect and we err and we make mistakes. And the thing is, can you learn from those mistakes? Are you willing to acknowledge the error, apologize maybe to those you've hurt, and repent? And so I called this fellow and said, and look, the first conversation we had, it was a phone call. He was at an airport in Long Beach, and he was basically speechless. I say, "I'm just calling to reach out, let you know I'm here. I'm happy to talk to you." And then we got on a Zoom like a couple days later, Andrew, and he was glassy-eyed and trying to make sense of what was happening to his life.
He'd seen his reputation destroyed and his life completely upended.
Exactly. It was like he was literally in a building and the entire building was burning down around him and he had no way out. And then we talked again a week later, and then a week later, and a week later, and then the weeks became months and the months became years. And I've talked to Damien, not quite every week, but dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of weeks. And I did that because I've watched him evolve and grow. Not just, what's the word? Like not just externally, again, from a white supremacist who joins the Navy, who becomes a coder and an entrepreneur and a CEO, but like internally as a person who's reckoned with his past and resolved himself to do better. And I think as head of the ADL, I deal with big geopolitical issues and whatnot, but I also, I'm a human being. And so helping him find his path has been one of the most rewarding experiences I've had in this job.
I think counsel culture should be the new norm and standard.
100%.
And it's one thing that I admire about what you advocate in your book, which is that, look, there has to be a path to understanding or redemption for people that want it. I mean, if someone doesn't want it.
No, that's really important. Like if you are a serial offender, if you are unwilling to acknowledge what you've done, what you're doing, if you will only listen to yourself and the counsel of the people that you trust rather than those who you've hurt, look, that's a different story. I don't have patience for people who, continue to offend. But if you're willing to try, I think it's up to the rest of us to be willing to help you. I don't know. I shouldn't say that for everyone, but I think it's my job. And I think it's those of us in public life, Andrew, can always do better.
So we talked about how there was this wave of democratization and then it seems to be reversing. And a woman I spoke to recently, Barbara Walter, wrote a book
that
suggests
how Civil War started.
Yeah, that suggests that social media might be part of the reversal.
Yeah.
That there is something of a negative correlation between social media adoption and democratization, which was a very, striking negative correlation. You started an anti-Facebook campaign.
Yeah.
That was the biggest, most significant effort I've seen.
Yeah.
You got dozens of major corporations to get on board. What catalyzed that effort?
So, first of all, I would just recognize like Professor Walter, like she's a professor at UCSD. Like, I really admire her scholarship, and her book is terrific. And I think there's something to what she said about the pernicious role of social media. So when I joined ADL, again, I had worked in the Valley. I had worked inside Google. Like, I understand these companies, but I was seeing how Facebook was the front line in fighting hate. So ADL opened a center in Silicon Valley in 2017. I think we're the first civil rights group to have a physical presence. We were in Palo Alto,
Smart.
Off University Road. Yeah. And I didn't, I didn't put like some nonprofit fundraiser to run it. I recruited a guy from Reddit, the guy who used to be VP for revenue products at Reddit, to run it. So it's staffed with software engineers and data scientists and programmers. And we engage on a day-to-day basis with all the big companies, from Amazon to Zoom, from Apple to YouTube, Google and Instagram, and of course Facebook. We'll talk about that, and Twitter and TikTok. We're working with the gaming companies, and the problems there are off the fucking wall.
No, go ahead, man. You can swear on this podcast.
But they're off the wall, and the messaging platforms. So we work with all these different kind of arenas. But to the point that you were making, and to what Professor Walter said, like, there's no question that while many of them, and we work with them to identify hate speech and help them understand what extremists are doing, the toughest one to work with by far is Facebook.
Wow.
I mean, so we do annual.
So you met with Mark Zuckerberg?
Many times.
Yeah.
And look, like, there's a lot of good people there who mean well. I would say that. I have friends who work at Facebook.
Sure.
But the kind of groupthink that happens there is extraordinary. And whereas a lot of the companies, again, none of them are clean. They're all have their issues. But we do an annual survey of online hate and harassment. We've been doing it for years. And the data is crazy. 42% of people who use social media say that they've been bullied online. 28%. This is our 2021 survey. We haven't done this year's yet. 28. It's probably worse. 28% say they've been systematically, like, continually bullied or stalked or, harassed online. But the place where it happens the most, Facebook, it happens on Facebook 3 times as often as any other platform. 3 times as often. The Instagram numbers are terrible too. And while we brought this stuff to these companies again and again, we had a situation in the summer of 2020, right after the death of George Floyd, where we were, my analysts watch the extremists. I mean, that's what we do. And we had extremists.
They need a vacation.
They all do, and lots of counseling. But we saw on Facebook groups the extremists organizing to disrupt the Black Lives Matter protests. And we brought that to Facebook, and they wouldn't do anything about it.
Wow.
I mean, the highest value there is really freedom of expression. But I don't think...
Dude, it's freedom of money.
It's freedom of money. It's freedom of revenue. But like my friend Sacha Baron Cohen says, I don't think freedom of speech equals freedom of reach. But they've allowed the lunatic fringe to go from the fringe right into the mainstream. And so I reached out to Derek Johnson, who runs the NAACP, and to Rashad Robinson, who runs a group called Color of Change. I said,
of course.
We need to get organized. And so we launched this campaign. We called it Stop Hate for Profit. That's right. That's right.
Yes. Okay, so you kick off Stop Hate for Profit, which is a very audacious campaign. And you do wind up with some major corporate...
I tell you what, when we started the campaign, we said, we started it in June. We said, take the month of July off Facebook. We told companies, don't advertise on Facebook for the month of July. And when we started the campaign, we didn't have a single company lined up. I mean, it was very audacious.
It's a little bit like my presidential campaign.
I suppose. 3 weeks later, we had over 1,100 companies, the biggest brands in the world.
Incredible.
Coca-Cola, McDonald's,
So why were they so
Starbucks.
receptive, do you think?
I'll tell you exactly why. Because we gave them examples of like white supremacist and anti-Semitic and racist content on Facebook. like flighted against their ads.
Yeah, that's pretty convincing.
So here's an Amazon ad, next to like a bloody truck that says, let's go get the next George Floyd. Or here's a Salesforce ad or a Verizon ad, and so on and so forth. And you put that out there, and Howard Schultz says, I don't want Starbucks advertising alongside the Nazis. But that's what Facebook was doing.
Wow.
And, like I've talked to them many times. I had a conversation once with Mark, and he said, around all of this, I think maybe that's in the book, and he said, Jonathan, a few years ago, all of the hate content on Facebook was user reported, he said to me. Today, 88% is caught by our AI before users even see it. So I think we're doing pretty good. And I said, okay, well, I used to be an executive at Starbucks. We didn't get to say 88% of our coffee doesn't have poison in it. So we think we're doing pretty good.
Yeah, especially if you imagine the number of messages they're talking about. I mean, you have 12% out there. 12% of an enormous number is an enormous number.
Yes, that is the law of large numbers. It's huge. And as much as we knew then, I mean, the way we got the concessions, all these companies came off. And then we organized with Sasha and Leo DiCaprio and Selena Gomez, the campaign to get celebrities off Instagram. Kim Kardashian, they all joined us. So for a week in August, they all got off the platform.
Maybe they were grateful not to have to post for a week.
Yeah, they were. I did hear that. I heard that people like, oh my God, thank goodness. But it also is important to them. Like, it's important to their brands. It's how they engage with their fans. So those two things led Facebook to, okay, we're actually ready to talk. And they did what we asked. They hired a VP for civil rights, like we asked. They started classifying Holocaust denialism as hate speech, like we asked. They took off white supremacist groups, like we asked. They released the results of an audit. They agreed to do an audit. I mean, they did a bunch of things. It's not nearly enough. And, I've heard people say, well, what do you expect? And stuff is difficult. Like, this is the most sophisticated platform in the history of capitalism.
Yes.
They will earn $120 billion this year, like a 24% net margin. I mean,
if the balance was reversed where, look, they're making more money by getting that 88% up to 99.999% as opposed to less money, like, they'd get it right.
You are entirely correct. Like, that's exactly the right calculus. So the problem is, as you're saying, the incentives are totally misaligned. There's no regulatory oversight because there's a thing in the law called Section 230. And they have these
written before Facebook was
written in like 1996, I think. And I mean, there's this hyper libertarian ethos inside the company, and many of us might self-identify as libertarians, but there's a problem when that libertarianism involves, again, using this product and the product to literally not just target and stalk, but to, cause physical harm to people, which we've seen happen on Facebook and on these other platforms. And, the reality is, all I would say, Andrew, to your point about how do you get it tonight? What if it were, 99.9% increase their revenues? They took the Nazis off. Like, think about J&J, the big pharma company. So when they had a Tylenol scare in the 80s, right, where a few bottles of Tylenol were tampered with in Chicago, like
they took every freaking bottle off the shelves.
Every bottle off every shelf in America and didn't put them back until they'd reformulated or redesigned the packaging.
And it turns out that was probably not even, like, it wasn't even there. They could have argued, like, look, this is not something that we need to, respond to at this scale.
Correct.
Yeah.
But they did that. Or I used to be in the beverage business. We were talking about that. Odwalla is a, ready to drink juice brand. And they had a situation where one bottle in the Bay Area, this is in the 90s, it's a non-flash pasteurized juice. So you can get, things in it, if you will, like bacteria and whatnot. And a toddler drank a bottle of Odwalla and got E. coli and died. Could be lethal for a little kid.
Terrible.
And so what did Odwalla do? They took every bottle off every shelf in America and redesigned the production process. So if Odwalla can do it, if J&J can do it, literally one of the most innovative companies in the history of business, they should do what every other business does. Take the product off the shelf and fix it. Like, knock the Nazis off the platform. Like, it isn't that hard, actually. You know, interestingly enough, and in a timely way, there was an announcement yesterday by Facebook that they are now allowing Ukrainians to say that they want to murder Russians or they want to kill Putin. You know, they said they're now allowing that because of the war. Like, I don't want Mark Zuckerberg deciding what kind of hate speech is okay or not okay. Like, you wouldn't allow a Ukrainian to go on the I don't know, on NBC or in the New York Times, right? He wants to murder all Ukrainians. Like, Facebook should just abide by the same rules, the same kind of standards that every other media platform abides by.
It does really boil down to Mark, doesn't it? I mean, what I hear about that company is that it's very, very centralized / top down / all the major decisions get funneled through Mark.
Now we get to, like, again, these broader issues. You know, it may seem off topic, but Mark controls 64 some odd % of the shares. He has these crazy Class A shares, give him all the voting rights. He's purged the board of all the independent directors. So there's no fiduciary responsibility there. It's the Mark show. And that kind of power vested in one person, I don't know. Clearly, it's not good governance vis-a-vis like the corporate world. And again, I think the company is too big and it invests too much power in any one person.
Yeah, if I had won the presidency, I was going to go to war with the social media companies, honestly, because I just didn't see a way that you could try and bring the country together that didn't involve very, very significant overhaul of their business practices and model.
Just repeal Section 230. Make them liable like every other business. If you did that and just that, now look, it would create some changes, right? Like maybe a restaurant wouldn't have as many, Yelp ratings or something. But the reality is we can see the consequences of unbridled, unfettered, totally unregulated social media. And we're living with the consequences today.
So a significant portion of the book is trying to guide people towards steps that they or we can take. And that you make an argument that I think most people appreciate, that, look, there are these attitudes and statements, and then there is a progression where then that leads to actions that ends up leading to,
that's right,
to systems. And then eventually it can reach a point where the unthinkable happens, as it has happened in other parts of the world. So what can the average person do if they want to try to keep our country as free of hate as it can be?
So I use in the book this construct we call the pyramid of hate that you're referring to. And it's this notion that things can go from bad to worse to catastrophic, from biased attitudes to prejudiced actions to systemic discrimination to kind of acts of violence to genocide. And I mean, we've got lots of examples in history where this is what happens. So then the question comes, well, how do you stop hate? To yours. So there's a heuristic that we use at ADL that I'll share. It starts with number one, speak out. So when you see hate happen, speak out. And whether it's in your Facebook feed or like in the locker room or in the workplace, on Zoom or at the water cooler, the dinner table, like speak out when you hear hate happen. And, to the earlier point of the conversation, like if you're a liberal, speak out when you hear progressives doing it. If you're a conservative, speak out when other conservatives are doing it. Like our ability to call out our people on our own team is really important. And that's part of how we depolarize here, is acknowledging, again, our own kind of frailty. So number one, you got to speak out. Number two, I think you got to share facts. Like this is what you do pretty well. We don't have enough of it. There's too much we have to dial down the drama, right? Like don't forward that crazy email from your like mother's neighbor's uncle, who's a QAnon enthusiast and all we need less drama, less hysteria, less hyperbole, focus on the facts and talk to people. Remember the golden rule of doing to others, right? Talk to people like you want to be spoken to. So I think sharing facts is really important. And then finally, showing strength. And for me, showing strength is not just being an ally and showing up for others, that's part of it. It's honestly, Andrew, it's like what you've done. It's leaning in and engaging in democracy. So whether you choose to start a nonprofit like Venture for America, whether you choose to run for office like you have done several times, create a new political party, and maybe to those who aren't quite so ambitious, because you're pretty ambitious, look, like go volunteer.
Yeah.
Go run for the local school board. Like go show up for the library. I mean, like, look, democracy is not a foregone conclusion.
No.
Neither is it a spectator sport. You got to be in it to win it. So I think for me, showing strength, our job at ADL, we would say, don't just lean in to fight hate. Lean in to kind of create hope and build, like what Dr. King called the benevolent or the beloved community that we all want.
Well, that is the vision. You know, the struggles right now, I mean, we can see it with what's happening internationally in Ukraine. You can see it in terms of the surge of hate that you're dealing with every day. Talking about social media running amok, in part because our government is asleep at the switch, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally.
We're in an era of kind of institutional challenge, institutional retreat.
Yeah.
And one of the big goals is like, how the heck can you buttress institutions or reinforce them in an era when people are just losing faith and confidence in them right and left? And there are a couple of things that so there are three things, that I try to push people on. And this is something, you and I are probably aligned on a lot of this stuff. So one, it's okay, let's just try and make our institutions better, stronger. Number two would be to try and modernize them, which we don't seem to do enough of.
Yes.
It's like you have this ridiculous, antiquated Section 230 that didn't conceive of social media as like the freaking, quasi state that it is. It's like, like why aren't we tackling that and then trying to start new efforts or institutions that may be able to earn people's trust? But this to me is like the massive challenge of this era, is that a lot of institutions are coming into question. I think social media is part of that too, because you used to have this curtain up where it's like, hey, so let's say I was a CEO or I was a public official, and then you only see me when I came on camera. And then now there's like this peering behind the veil, and it's kind of brought people down. And to some extent that's positive, because you're like, okay, it's like humanized. But then on the other hand, it's unfortunately really hard for folks to feel like these institutions have their best interest at heart, because they're seeing differently in different ways. I can't help but think, and when I was reading your book, I felt this. It's like I feel like what ADL stands for and wants to do, it's very kind of hand in hand with successful institutions, whether that's families, schools, religious communities, because it kind of takes a collective to lean in and say, like, look, there's no reason for us to hate each other. We're all human beings. Like, we all want and desire, deserve the same things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as you lay it out. I deeply believe in institutions. I do. I believe that institutions tend to kind of develop and evolve and accrete over time. Of course, they can be transformational in some things. They can be incrementalist in others. But the institutions are like the tent poles of our shared society. Like, they're crucial. That doesn't mean we leave them alone. Like, we need to continue to modernize and renew them. And yet at the same time, we also have to acknowledge when sometimes they're inadequate. Like, again, a two-party system that becomes so kind of corrupted by special interests, it doesn't create the space for other voices to be heard. And that allows for a kind of capture. So it's interesting. You think about, number one, how do you take these institutions, which have been so essential to what we have, and modernize and renew them? And at the same time, how do you acknowledge when we might need to create the space to reinvent those institutions? The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, are they institutions? I don't know. But our democracy
is institutions.
Well, they are, but they're like edifices. Democracy is the institution, right?
Yeah.
The elections are institutional. And so, like, I really appreciate what you've done and how you forced a conversation that needed to be had and that I think is far from over.
Well, I want to close with something that I think you and I also see eye to eye on, which is that that we have to do more to de-radicalize individuals.
Yes.
And this is one reason I admire your approach, where there is one thing you can say is to say, for example, stop hating other people. You have various public awareness campaigns, but then there's the more difficult, and I would suggest more pressing work, where you actually get into these groups and communities of people that have been corrupted and subverted by hate, and then bring them back.
Yep.
On the podcast, and like, gosh, it was a number of months ago now, but I had Christian Picciolini, who started an organization called Free Radicals. I feel like we have to be investing more in those kinds of organizations.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we've got to recognize the fact that in an environment where, again, social media has allowed, the fringe elements to move and the extremists from the margin into the mainstream, it's made it easier, sure, for many of us to connect with old classmates and family members in different places. It's also allowed these extremists to reach a much broader audience than was ever humanly possible. And that extremism, whether it takes the form of, the anti-vax people or the QAnon crazies, or, white supremacists or radical anti-Zionists, these other dangerous groups, I think we've got to create space to bring people back. So ADL is very committed to this work, whether it's one-on-one with someone like Christian Picciolini, like Damian Patton, who's in the book.
Yes.
Christian is a friend, and I so admire what he's done, which is a very similar path to the one that Damian walked. Or someone like Abdullah Intepli, who's in the book, who grew up in Turkey, educated in that kind of Islamic system, and learned to hate Jews and to hate Israel and the Jewish state, and then started to realize that it was all a line of BS. And when you actually meet people one-on-one, you realize they don't resemble the stereotype, and they don't hew to the demonic image that's been created.
Yes.
So whether you can be de-radicalized from extreme, white supremacy or extreme Islamism or any of the other dangers out there.
Anything that leads you to dehumanize and
to dehumanize and demonize other people. So we believe in that work. I respect what Christian has done. There are other groups like Life After Hate, which are doing really important work. Something I think a lot about is, how do we help them to scale?
Yes.
How do we give them the support, the systems? How do they use technology more effectively so they can reach a much wider audience? Because I could counsel Damien once a week, for an hour, but there are so many Damians out there. If we could reach them and find them, I can't spend an hour a week with every one of them, but I think there are ways we could help.
Yeah, we have to force multiply there, because and this is something that I would love to see happen, is that you take someone like Damian Patton, who now would completely renounce all of the beliefs that he held at that point.
Of course.
The problem is that there's still an aversion to, I think, working with people who've even had that in their past. And if someone renounces that and then wants to help others do the same, I feel like we should be bestowing all sorts of resources on them. I mean, I think about someone like Christian, but it seems like...
I could not agree more.
Yeah.
This is so important. Like, again, if someone is willing to take the risk, acknowledge their error, put themselves out there, we should be embracing them. We should be lifting them up. We should be looking for ways to give them support. I think this matters enormously. And so we're really, really committed to that work.
Well, John, I couldn't believe it was your first book, but it was a great one. It Could Happen Here: Why America is Tipping from Hate to the Unthinkable, and How We Can Stop It. If we do stop it, you're going to be one of the big reasons why. Thank you so much, my friend, for being here.
Thank you very much for having me, Andrew.